Welcome to the Rabia and Sana show. We're two Desi girls reinventing cultural norms with love to make difficult conversations easier to help you take courageous steps faster.
Whether you feel like a misfit now or have been breaking the standards, this podcast is for you, for the adults, the young. Come as you be and become your authentic self as you desire. Let's go reinvent some cultural norms together.
Hello everyone, I am Rabia Paracha. I have been a rebel without a cause for most of my life until I discovered my purpose to empower women to empower themselves. And that led me down a rabbit hole to become a life coach from CTI Coactive Coaching. And today I'm a mind and life power coach who helps people break free of their limiting cultural beliefs to find the life they love and the love of their life.
Hello everyone, I am Sana. I am from New Jersey, a Pakistani American. Professionally, I work in the clinical research field. And personally, I have always had this purpose of empowering women of South Asian culture to be able to live the life that they want to live and be true to themselves instead of what the culture expects them to be. And so here I am pursuing that purpose, and I am also studying to become a life coach. Let's get started.
Hello, amazing souls. Welcome to another episode of the Rabia and Sana show, the podcast where we reinvent cultural norms to elevate your mental, emotional, and relationship well-being. I'm Rabia Paracha.
And I'm Sana Shah. Today, we're talking about one of the most pressing challenges of our time: hate, extremism, and the polarization that divides us. For this conversation, we have Zahed Amanullah. Zahed has spent the last 20 years researching, analyzing, and coordinating efforts to combat hate and extremism. Zahed is an American Muslim. He pivoted to this field after 9/11, watching a polarized world push the boundaries of hate through transnational movements and algorithm amplification. He's been invited to the White House to meet Prince Charles, testified to the British and EU parliaments, and he now works with Fortune 500 companies to address these issues in the workplace. Wow, Zahed, it's such an honor to have you. Welcome to our show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
The work that you're doing, I think, is incredible because not too many of us want to get involved in these hard conversations. They're really difficult and they push boundaries. They do, confront a lot of backlash. It seems like you've been deconstructing this hate and polarization for quite some time now. And we hear about how hate spreads through transitional movements and social media algorithms. Can you break down for us, starting with what hate and extremism is? What does that look like in practice?
That's a really, really good question and a good place to start. When we talk about hate and extremism, we're talking about public discourse, but also actions by particular individuals or groups that seek to marginalize other people based on their identity in any number of ways, exclusion from the public square or outright hostility or violence. When we talk about the kind of world that we want to see, over the last several decades, this has been tested in political movements, in social and cultural movements, about how we can express ourselves, how we can influence culture in ways that are inclusive. When it comes to excluding people based on their backgrounds, whether it's religious, racial, or what have you, or gender identity, this is where we've seen problems. This is where we've seen conflict. Almost every conflict in the world in the modern era has been rooted in us versus them dynamics. We are the preferred group. You, for whatever reason, whether it's your nationality, your race, or what have you, are the excluded group. And then those divisions can take place in very subtle ways, in just sort of erasing history or sort of excluding from the public square, to outright discrimination, segregation, and violence. So, this is not something that's born of the third world. We've, of course, seen it in Western societies going back to World War I and World War II, but also in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement and so forth. So a lot of people like to speak about these topics as, oh, that happens to people who are in poverty, or, oh, that happens to people who are, in developing countries. It's not an issue for me because we have laws. And we've seen increasingly that's not the case. I think the big lesson in the social media era, so say in the last 15 to 20 years, is that we're dealing with aspects of human nature that are unfortunately always going to be with us. And the challenge for us is how do we mitigate the negative aspects of that? How do we make sure that as few people as possible are being either drawn into hate movements and extremist narratives or are suffering as a consequence because of them? Like that's the challenge. It's naive to think that we can eliminate hate and extremism. And I think a lot of conversations start with the way that, for example, the war on drugs started, that we'll have a war and we'll eliminate all drugs or poverty or what have you. The world isn't that simple. And so, we have to be realistic, but we also have to be sort of clear-eyed about what it is we're trying to fight, not to overreach. In some cases, for example, people want to fight hate and extremism by over-policing, over-surveilling, over-censoring people. And that's not the answer either. The challenge here has been to find a middle ground where we can optimize and maximize the cultural impact of an inclusive world and minimize the disruption that comes from people who want to tear society apart at the seams. So that's kind of the overview of the issue at hand.
And that is quite a challenging issue at hand right now. Zahed, what do you think is the role of misinformation and disinformation in the time that we're in right now? And
Yeah.
given the aspect of technology getting involved with that?
The big challenge for that is, first of all, those terms. They're not universally agreed upon terms to describe the phenomenon that we see, how people are misled or misinformed in a way that causes further division and conflict. People mislead each other all the time. People misinform each other all the time. Sometimes it's quite innocuous, like gossip. Sometimes it has real world impact. And, the ability to misinform on a mass scale, which of course is aggravated by the way our social media algorithms work, has caused the issue that we're seeing. And this is why you hear these terms more now, even though the phenomenon of misinformation and disinformation has existed for hundreds of years. So it becomes a problem when the scale reaches such a point that you can subvert elections or you can provoke violence. And there are real world examples that we're seeing now that demonstrate how a little bit of misinformation or disinformation can have a ripple effect and cause greater and greater impacts until it reaches a stage of violence. And to me, that's the big warning sign that we have. The ability for misinformation and disinformation to aggregate to the point where violence happens has gone from a multi-year process to a multi-hour process. So the biggest example I can point to that is kind of very much rooted in a deliberate attempt to misinform people are the riots that happened in Stockport, England in the summer of last year. In hindsight, going back, we can see that it was caused by a deliberately introduced piece of disinformation about the identity of an immigrant or the child of an immigrant family who murdered schoolgirls in a dance class. And the rumor was that this was an illegal immigrant who was of a Muslim background. And then that was amplified by social media platforms, by big influencers like Andrew Tate and Elon Musk, to the point where it stirred up enough anti-Muslim sentiment that people actually gathered around mosques and started attacking them. And that happened within the space of a week. And then, it was clearly determined later that the disinformation that was put out by an individual and amplified by state actors and other people with malintent. So the formula is there. And then we saw a repeat of this in the presidential debates of last year, where accusations were made about the immigrants in Springfield, Ohio. That similarly had a similar trajectory, where it was clearly disinformation. It was rooted in some false narratives that were easily disproven by the residents and the mayor of Springfield, Ohio. And then it grew into this, and it was amplified by the presidential candidate himself. And that led to threats on the ground, etc. So we see the pattern now of why it's so important and what it can lead to. This is why it makes it so important to start to tackle it.
Right. What I'm hearing is that there's so much information that spreads like fire, whether it's correct or not, or it's rooted in some truth or integrity. And Facebook has now removed the fact check the last couple of days, the TikTok ban. What is your perspective on these things do you think they're going to perpetuate more disinformation and misinformation? How do you think that's going to work?
Um, Unfortunately, yes, is the short-term answer. And, like lots of social phenomenon, unfortunately has to get worse before it gets better. Part of the challenge is that we haven't done enough, and by we, I mean people who are monitoring these sort of phenomenon and trying to sort of, you know, provide responsible legislation to govern how social media algorithms work. We haven't done enough to convince the public because the public is sort of, is still being influenced by people who are basically accepting the risks of what can happen when you don't have fact checking and you don't have curbs on disinformation that are, and by disinformation, I mean things that are deliberately intended to incite. It's not disinformation about political opinions or opinions about a celebrity. We're talking about, specific types of disinformation, lies really, that are meant to influence a particular dynamic that leads to discrimination, hostility, or violence. That's what we're really concerned about. So, but by framing it as a free speech issue, we're missing the part about free speech that means you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's the closest analogy I can think of. If we accept that, even with America's First Amendment, that, free speech has some limits, we should be able to apply the same logic to the discourse that happens online, that there are some things you can't do. We already have that, for example, in defamation law. You know, you can't go online or anywhere and actually just spread defamatory information about somebody. So it's not like there's not a precedent for ensuring that people aren't harmed by the things that are said online. But because this thing is so hard to define and to pinpoint, one person's disinformation, of course, is another person's free speech. So legislating on the back of this is very difficult. So attempts to legislate this have happened in the EU and the UK. And even they struggle because they rely on social media platforms to basically enforce their own policies. And social media platforms, they don't want to have disruptive environments necessarily. I mean, maybe X is an outlier there. So they have their own standards that are above and beyond what the law says, and they have until now basically said, look, we're not going to allow you to promote hostility against any protected background, all of that. So those guardrails are starting to fall now. In a way, we're going to find out what that means in real life before we can start to pull back. So the important thing for us, people like us who do research online, is to track the negative consequences of the lack of guardrails and say to society, look, this is what happens to society when people are free to demonize groups of people, spread misinformation about an incident that causes violence on the ground. The structures have to be there in society to protect us, whether it's law enforcement or legislation or what have you. At some level, those have to kick in. So we're in a brave new world. 2025 is going to be the year where we discover how bad this is going to get before we can hopefully make things better.
So with the fact checking being gone, I'm just thinking of how sometimes information is also good, right? In the use of technology in providing us with things that we wouldn't know living in one side of the world. Where now with social media, we can actually see live what's happening. And if we're not able to see that narrative coming out in news and things like that, we cannot see it live. So the aspect of getting information which is correct, not misinformation, not disinformation, but getting correct information and removing the fact checking may also allow us to question the information which is correct also.
And this is the key point. The reason that disinformation has such a negative impact is because most of us are passive users of these new information technologies. We have always been of the opinion that you can only fight bad ideas and bad speech with good ideas and good speech. In other words, the people who are promoting divisive ideas or outright hostility are, in essence, filling a vacuum. And that vacuum exists because not enough of us are filling that public space with positive content, with positive views. Think about how culture in the West has changed over the last 50 years. That means, for example, attitudes towards women, attitudes towards LGBT, attitudes towards race. Although things aren't perfect, they've changed for the better over the last 50 years. You go back 50 years, you had wildly different ideas about the roles of of all these types of people. The reason that happened is because why? Because people fought for it. People fought in the public space to advocate for the dignity of people who were considered different. That was an active process. What we don't have now are people filling the public square with active voices to plead for tolerance, to plead for open-mindedness, to plead for digital literacy in general, just knowing how to use our technologies. We're all still passive, right? The major content platforms, especially TikTok, which of course is now banned or might be banned, you have between 1% and 5% of people creating the TikTok. The rest of us are just passive viewers. So that creates a real opportunity for people to disproportionately influence, the wider social media using public. Now that, as you mentioned, that could be used for good or for bad. TikTok, if you've watched it recently, you've seen content creator after content creator basically saying goodbye to people, talking about how the platform changed their life by allowing them to positively influence other users of the platform. Whereas in other platforms, you have people who disproportionately provide a negative influence. And the biggest example I can think of off the top of my head is Andrew Tate, who provided a disproportionately negative influence on young men, and especially on attitudes towards women and so forth. So we're seeing exactly how the dynamic works for good or for bad. And until more of us reclaim that public space with positive content and with, the kind of ideas that provide resilience against people who are exposed to bad ideas. Basically, if somebody comes and says you should hate those people, people can say, you know what, I know about those people, and there's no reason for me to hate them. So that will only happen if we fight for the influence of people who may be swayed one way or the other with positive examples of the diversity that we have, for example, in the world. That's a way we can fight to make the idea is to make misinformation and disinformation less effective. And that'll only happen when we're informed, when we are savvy enough to know how to use our digital spaces, when we have enough knowledge, information, and to make our own decisions, and be resilient to those kind of bad ideas.
Right. And I believe that some of your work that you're doing is bridging these divides and building resilience in the society
Yeah.
at large. So one of the most fascinating aspects of your work is this between adversaries. So can you give us a real life example? You created these polarized groups and created that connection.
Well, over the last 15 years, we've tried to test out how to do this effectively. And, we did actually a lot of research with Google and with Facebook like 15 years ago on how their platforms could be used to create this, to, influence people to create positive content and what have you. And we tested it across Europe. We tested it in developing countries like Kenya and Sub-Saharan Africa. We tested it in the US, tried to catch different demographics, different age ranges, different languages, and to see what worked. And, the truth is, it was challenging. It was challenging because most people that we would try to work with, especially young people, didn't feel the urgency necessarily to make those environments safe because unless they were directly the recipient of hateful, content online. So unless they were of a racial background or religious background or what have you that has actually experienced it, it was just hard to get the rest of everyone sort of excited about protecting those spaces. In other words, we took the spaces for granted, or we were too distracted by all of the, bells and whistles that were going on in the social media landscape. So then we tried, of course, working in schools and creating toolkits to sort of make sure that people were exposed to good digital literacy information. And, that had some positive effects. The trouble there being that every country has a different approach to this. It's not easy to get into every school. Where we did test it and implement it, especially amongst people of different backgrounds, we saw successes. So for example, we funded a lot of projects that, from civil society that tested different ways of trying to stimulate this type of dialogue in schools. And one of them was a virtual reality headset that puts you in the shoes of an immigrant or someone of a different racial background, and how you would respond to being treated with racial epithets and so forth. And you can literally choose your next step, and it would, create almost a gamified way of figuring out how to deal with it. So for people who don't know how to literally, take walk in the shoes of another type of, of group of people, this was a very practical way to do that. So every time we would test something like that, we would have really positive effects. The trouble is scale, resources, getting it to everyone. So in other words, we've tested things that work. The challenge is getting it to work on a wider scale. And that's where we've struggled. And not just we ourselves as an organization, but people across this space have really struggled to sort of get ideas that work scaled up so that they're in every school and what have you. Which brings me to the workplace issue, because that's then another strategy of what we try to do to see where we haven't really considered testing these ideas. Is there a space for us to work? And, even that was a difficult space to get into until October 7th of last year. And that actually provided an opportunity for us to see that there was a problem where different groups of people were basically going after each other within a space where we could find resources and support to actually implement solutions. So that is most of my work in the last year and a bit. And that's where I see we have the most promise, because at least it deals with an environment that is very controlled, that is very much willing to provide resources for different groups to speak to each other, provide areas of reconciliation, trauma support, all of that. That's what's missing in our wider society. We don't have those resources for people. We know how to make laws and enforce them with law enforcement. We don't know how to provide that kind of mental health support and the kind of spaces for dialogue, the kind of counseling and guidance that allows people to sort of understand each other and not just hate each other. So that's the big challenge.
Zahed, what do you think that we individuals can do in our daily lives to foster this understanding and to tackle this challenge?
A great question. I think the biggest thing that people can do is, everyone will at some point in their life feel the tug of hate. At some point, everyone will be provoked to think about another group of people in a hateful, derogatory, or whatever manner. If people are aware of that, right, we have to acknowledge that it's human nature. If people are aware of that, we should have the strength to stop and think and make a pledge to understand the group of people that we're being sort of guided to hate. The best way to do that is to get to know someone who's of that background. That's why I've worked in interfaith and other kinds of spaces. That's where that makes that person-to-person interaction hugely impactful when it comes to moderating the way that people feel about people who are different from them. We've tried online campaigns. We've tried other, they work to a degree, but not nearly as well as face-to-face interaction does. So this is something, interestingly, that we've been implementing in workplaces, places for people to gather who are of different backgrounds, and try to talk about common ground and talk commonalities. In the workplace, the common, mission is that of working together as a productive entity to help the company grow and be successful, or organization. In society, if you're in a city or a community, your common goal is to make sure your community is safe and thriving and what have you. And those things can happen when people make an effort to reach out. Now, that has to be coupled with, and this is another part that I do a lot of work in, if you are a community that is the victim of a lot of this discourse, it is also your responsibility to reach out, to have effective communication and outreach, to make sure you tell your story before other people tell your story. I've been involved in a number of case studies where, and I I'm a Muslim background, for example, I've spoken to Muslims in different communities that are victims of Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hate. There's a big issue going on in the UK right now. Elon Musk and others have amplified, which is this issue of grooming gangs, which is an inflated issue from 10 years ago, but completely disproportionately targeted toward people of Muslim Pakistani background, particularly in the UK. And there's a trial that's going to happen next week, and police have been in touch with me and others to brace ourselves for an onslaught of anti-Muslim hatred. And what is the natural thing for communities to do is to sort of shut the doors, turn out the lights, and basically lock yourself in and just wait for it all to blow over. And I try to encourage people. It's like, no, actually, this is now the time when you have to put your voice out and basically explain who you are, what you believe, why you feel that, targeting of women is wrong and why it's un-Islamic and why the people who have done these things are criminals, no matter what their race or religion. Those are the voices that need to be out there. Because without those voices, it's very easy to convince bystanders that everyone of that racial or religious background believes this. So individuals, if they're of that background, it's being targeted, it's your responsibility to reach out and communicate. If you're not of that background, it's your responsibility to understand that not everything you hear applies to the entire group of people. That's almost true universally, whether whatever race background or religious background you are. If you hear something bad about a person of that background, instinctively you should know that that does not apply to all the people of that background. And until that day when everyone understands that, we're always going to be susceptible to this. So that's really what people can do.
Right. And I think what you're saying about storytelling and voicing, that's a big form of education, right? We share
Yeah.
our real life lived experience. And that also, I think, allows empathy
Yeah.
and relate as human beings versus as this type of person or that type of person. Can you tell us a little bit, how can we show empathy? How does empathy show up in these situations when people are telling stories? Because some of us don't know how.
Well, I would start with, the aspects of basic humanity that we all experience. We all experience grief, loss, we experience joy, we experience the challenges of day-to-day life. There's always a way to relate to someone who's different from you. So one of the examples I think that was really impactful, I mentioned these riots. So there's an imam who's a friend of mine who's actually an English convert to Islam, but he's become quite an influential imam in Liverpool. His name's Adam Kelwick. And part of this might be because culturally he's of both an English background and an Islamic background. But when the riots happened, he would go out into the streets like, I want to meet these protesters. I want to meet them and see what makes them tick. And then I want to invite them into our mosque and give them tea. Now, that is a sort of a way of thinking that not many people who are being attacked would think. You'd have to have a thick skin, you have to be pretty brave, and you have to be culturally literate in that Imam Kelwick, because he was of an English background, he was a Liverpool supporter, he knew how to connect with the people who he knew, like a lot of the people who are white, working class, middle-aged, football supporters, and so forth. He knew how to connect on that level. And once he cracked that, there are pictures of him hugging these protesters. That's all it took. It wasn't that hard. Once these people felt like, oh my God, this guy is nothing like I imagined, and he gets me, and he's a Liverpool supporter, and he's inviting me for tea, why do I feel hatred? So that could be true if you take somebody of a rich, wealthy Western background and drop them in the middle of, the Sahara Desert. There's always a place where you can connect on basic values or basic needs, basic wants. There's always a way to connect if you have humility, I think is the biggest part of that. You have to realize that, the world doesn't revolve around you, regardless of whatever background. You can feel this as a victim or an oppressor, We all need to reel it in a little bit, the way we feel, that everything has to start and end with us. And from there, amazing things can happen. But it takes a bit of creativity, takes a bit of courage, takes a bit of effort and wisdom. And if one guy can do it like that, I think that's in every one of us. That again wasn't complicated.
Right. And I just wanted to add, as you were talking, something came up for me is that nonviolent communication and
Yeah,
actually listening to each other versus just speaking about whatever we want. And that's a great book by Marshall Rosenberg about
yeah,
nonviolent communication. And so I think we can learn about how to communicate and express ourselves
yeah,
without dehumanizing someone else or making them feel less than human. And I think that's what this imam did is that he embraced, the adversary and made them feel human and
yeah.
welcomed them. And I think that's not an easy thing to do, but
No,
really something we can all strive for in our small ways, right?
absolutely. And another scholar I reference in this narrative creation is Dr. Marshall Gans in Harvard, who was an organizer for Barack Obama's campaign. So he has these narrative structures um, that he uses for trying to achieving social justice, the story of us, the story of now, and reframing the way you think that in a way that's inclusive
Mhm.
and nonviolent, of course, is that gateway to that new reality about, well, who are we? Are we just my racial, religious group and everyone else is an outsider? Or are we a broader society of values where instinctually I include people rather than exclude people. I've seen people live their whole lives to go through that arc of being, and this happens a lot in immigrant communities where you start off being very sort of like us and them, and not in a way that's meant to foster discrimination, but you want to protect your culture. You want to, you want to protect your kids from the negative influence of society. Reaching adulthood, you realize, wow, I'm not an outsider anymore. I'm part of this society. I'm part of these people. My kids are culturally part of this society. I can't separate them if I tried. And that's something a lot of immigrant communities go through, and especially immigrants who are victims of hate. They go through that cycle. So by the time you're third or fourth generation, you have the confidence and you have the cultural literacy. You can navigate all that. What doesn't happen is the other way around. For majority societies to feel that society is changing, it's becoming more multicultural, it's becoming more, almost majority minority in some cases. And what's happening now in our environment is like the people who are feeling threatened by that, strictly on the grounds of race. They feel like these brown people are coming in to replace us. And my argument to them, and I have some, discussions online with people who are trying to do that. I'm like, you know what? I was born in California. If you were asking me what my culture is, I'm Californian. I lived in the UK for 20 years. I'm still Californian. They say, oh, but you're brown and your parents are from India. I'm like, I've spent 4 weeks of my life in India. That I've known plenty of white people who've lived in India and are more Indian than I am. And my kids are going to be even more, they're a product of the West. So part of the challenge is for people who aren't of different racial backgrounds to realize that, culture is a fluid thing, and as much as, and that, believe it or not, Western culture has a greater influence on immigrant communities than immigrant culture has on Western communities. Yes, Western communities will like the food, and you name the kung fu, you name whatever that comes into the Western, culture, pizza, but outside of language and some traditions, immigrants become Western, right? And they become, they get elected to public office and they help form the laws and they succeed in business and medicine and I think and they just become integrated with the fabric. So that's the part I think where reframing the dialogue about who we are as a community or as a country or as a society has to involve everyone. Immigrants are doing their part in that because they're the ones that started on the lower rungs of the ladder and they're working their way up. But others have to kind of meet people halfway and understand that we have a world in which people are mobile. It's not just brown people coming to the West. We know that Westerners have gone all over the world in colonialism or other ways for centuries. So it's a two-way street. So, the big danger right now that's influencing everything is this idea of great replacement, this sort of idea that whites are being replaced in Europe and North America. That's the biggest challenge today. And that impotence on that really rests on the people who are being influenced by that dynamic, largely white Westerners who feel afraid. They feel afraid that the way that immigrants felt afraid when they came to the West. They feel threatened. They want to put the walls up. They want to do, they're doing the same thing in reverse. So immigrants, we have an answer to that because we've now lived through many generations of overcoming that. We need our white brothers and sisters to reach back the other way so that we don't have these opportunities for hate and extremism. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, I think that fear that arises with opening up and accepting another culture or another change, it's what's the main driving force behind us resisting. And a lot of that fear arrives from the conditioning that we have had when we grow up, from our parents telling us in whatever ways, right, that it shows up in society and in culture that the other culture is others. They're not one of us, and that creates these boundaries between us. So what do you think that we can do to unlearn that conditioning that over time has become really strong beliefs in us as a society?
That's really difficult. That is really, really difficult. In some of the research that we've done, where we speak to young people and we speak to older people, who, by the way, are more vulnerable to disinformation than younger people. Actually, the young people we go to are actually quite savvy. So the best thing is to start early. Ultimately, we want our young generation to be ambassadors for a confident new world where people get along and the issues that our parents had are no longer issues. In other ways, they can teach us, the older generations, about not fearing those differences. And I know that immigrant children, have done amazing things with that. We've seen, for example, I guess a really good example is the way that the children of immigrants have now become more and more active in our cultural spaces, in music and film and TV and as influencers. A huge surge of confident Gen Z, people going out there and basically have no hangups about their background or participating in the public square. So I think people can unlearn things when they basically are exposed to things that challenge their viewpoints about what will happen if we let this fester. Is that happening? I think we're now, one, two generations, three generations into immigrant migration to Western countries. And the answer is no, it hasn't. I mean, like, you can see people who are simultaneously unwilling to let go of their fundamental cultural background, but also fundamentally, insistent about their place in Western society and how that is part of their identity too. I mentioned the sort of cultural landscape. It's a great way to do that because you're looking at forms of communication that are Western, but infusing that with new blood, and that is being appreciated across the board. It's not because there's an immigrant market. It's because fresh ideas are for everyone's benefit. And the immigrant story is really that. They have broadened the idea of what the public space is to everyone's benefit. I mean, in Britain, everyone still says for the last 30 years that the most popular dish is curry. It's like, okay, and I'm sure it's pizza and whatever and no one blinks, right? They don't say they've taken away our food. And it's like, okay, no, not really. Everyone, you can't fight with the way that people like choose to enrich their lives. And if they choose to enrich their lives by dipping into the cultures of other places, that's great. And that's what it's about. And the other thing I would say is, and I always say this to people who are very skeptical about people of different backgrounds. It's like, go spend some serious time in a country that, that you think is backwards. And you will learn very, very quickly that they're not only not backwards, but they could teach you a thing or two. And they're as modern as you think you are. They're probably more technologically savvy than you are. And they're becoming places that actually Westerners want to go live in. 50 years ago, it was completely like poverty-stricken, wastelands. At least that's what we were told. And now, you have Westerners wanting to go live in Morocco, the Middle East, or Malaysia. Because why? Because the standard of living is so high. And it's so, yeah, that's what happens. That's what globalization does. Everyone gets the best of everything, right? So our mindset has to change so that we understand that everyone is benefiting by this interaction around the world. It's not coming at the expense of anyone. So, yeah, that's what I would do.
Yeah, I feel like it's the evolution of humanity.
It is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And as you're talking, I remember I grew up in Canada here. I'm second generation Canadian. And I went back to Pakistan after I got married. And the world I saw and the world that I thought existed there were two different worlds. And now my children are third generation Canadian. There's such a big gap between my mom and my children.
And likewise, yeah.
Yeah, and so you can see the progress that we've lived through. And my children don't identify as a traditional Pakistani Muslim.
Yeah.
Right? They have their own new identity. And I think sometimes this is a conversation about identity, and there's a lot of personal growth involved, right? We've got to evolve within ourselves. And yeah, can you tell us from your perspective, how has your work changed you over the years?
Well, first of all, I'm going to start with the anecdote you just mentioned because my kids are going through the same thing. My daughter's in university. My son's going to go to university in a couple of years, and we've always been very light touch about like identity in the sense that we live a certain way, and we hope that that's an influence, but we've never been sort of, you must do this, you must do that. And it's really nice to see my kids on their own exploring our cultural background and learning and adopting things on their own to suit where they feel their identity sits. Like that to me is the most organic process that anyone can go through. And it's more real when it's done that way, when it's a learning process that an individual takes and they find their comfort zone. They want to learn more, great. They've learned enough, that's fine too. Just, find your comfort zone so you're confident, because that confidence is the most important thing. Now, in our work, it's it's very similar. We try to stimulate that kind of communication so that people find confidence. We call it resilience when it comes to, like, for example, societies or communities where it's difficult for somebody to come in and stir things up because that society is like, no, we're fine. We have no trouble with each other. Like Malaysia, for example, is, just to pull one country out, is a Muslim majority country, but it has a very, very large Chinese minority background. And for years, they've had to kind of figure out where that balance is of identities and whether they conceive of a cultural national identity that they can call Malaysian that's inclusive of Malays or Chinese or Indians or whoever comes to live in Malaysia. And last time I was there, I had lots of conversations about this. And as they were able to basically create a society where no one felt discriminated against and whatever, that sensibility came to the surface. And it made it quite resilient to, for example, extremist groups that have gone to go sow unrest. They don't find a home in Malaysia. So our work is geared toward replicating that dynamic to make sure that there's no fertile soil for extremism to grow because people have had those conversations. They've had that organic understanding of what their identity is. They have that confidence. And that's the best thing you can do to basically, it's one thing to go after the bad guys. That's really difficult because for so many reasons, the law doesn't quite encapsulate what it takes unless you commit a crime or act of terrorism or what have you. And ideas are hard to fight in that way. But if you go to the people, like, and empower people instead of just trying to, you kind of have to do all of it. But I think the big part's lacking is just empowering people. Find your identity, become resilient, become confident, and don't let anyone turn you against each other. Don't turn poor against rich. Don't turn, it's like find a way that everyone feels like they're thriving. And you have a fair society. That's also part of it. The polarization that we talk about can also be economic. And when you have too much of a haves and have-nots, that's a very easy environment for hateful, extremists to come in and disrupt. So that's the kind of, messaging we try to encourage people to sort of to participate in. So there's a whole bunch of initiatives that we've worked with the social media companies on trying to advocate for that, but now we work with other, community groups and others to sort of make sure that that's the kind of common messaging they're pushing out. And, and again, with companies to basically, they're a first port of call for basically people who are bringing in the hate from the outside and they turn it against each other. And there's an environment there where you can actually sit people down and say, right, let's go over why this isn't right, not just for our company, but for yourselves as people, and bring in counselors and what have you. And it works because you've got that environment where you can kind of teach that. So I think that there's the answer is kind of there in front of us. It's just the will and the resources to sort of make sure that it spreads so that, the kind of racial anxiety that we had 50 years ago and that's not so existent today is going to be the truth for the next generation, that the anxieties that we feel today aren't felt by my daughter's generation or the subsequent generation. That's the goal.
Wow, that is such an important line of work that you're in, Zahed, and so challenging and requires so much emotional resilience, so much courage, so much bravery. And so, thank you for everything that you're doing for this is all of society, like globalization, that you're doing so much work in. And as you have said, it's a lonely field, it's underrepresented, undersourced, but your drive is very commendable. So what gives you hope to continue in this line of work, and what keeps you optimistic about the future?
Um, what gives me hope is I think, the better angels of our human nature are always there. They may be hidden, they may be, temporarily out of sight, but I believe that they're there in everyone. And so our work relies on awakening those angels and making sure that people do the right thing when it comes to their families, their neighbors, their society. And and not that we're just one small organization. It's not, we can't do everything, but what we can try to do is influence others to do the same thing. That's why we're a nonprofit NGO. We don't own anything that we do in the sense that we're happy for people to copy what we do. We want these to be models that could be replicated and making sure the barrier to entry is low enough so that almost anyone can do it. And we've kind of cracked that in a whole bunch of different environments. But the fact that we see successes when we test these things makes me want to keep doing it and being appreciated, frankly. It's really kind words that you said, and I don't take it lightly, but I get that feedback now a lot more than I did when I started this work, and that makes me feel like I'm making a difference. And you know what, and seeing my, even my kids, when they see something here and there and they feel, proud. If I just had that, that would be plenty, frankly. So, that's what keeps me going.
That's quite remarkable because you're reinventing cultural norms, something that we talk about all the time. And to be a South Asian in this space, it must have its challenges as well. But it's good to know that you've seen the shift over your 20 years of work. You've seen the progress, and that just keeps it more worthwhile. And I think when you find something that you're deeply connected to and you don't give up that easy, right? You
Yeah.
keep going because you're seeing the progress. It takes time, as we know. So, if you could tell our listeners, how can they connect to that place, right? You've got this passion, and we all want to do it. What's a small thing you could tell our listeners, like a message you could leave them with about
Wow.
creating that cultural norm shift, like creating a new culture?
That's a really good question. And it's not an easy thing to do, by the way. It's like I think a lot of, culture shifts, I think, have been studied by people for generations, and everyone wants to kind of master it. It's kind of like mastering virality on social media. It's like you kind of know it when you see it, but how do you get from here to there? And we all have kind of little ingredients that we know that will help in that mix. The biggest thing I think is envisioning the world that you want to see to start with. No one wants to put all this effort into shifting the cultural landscape unless they have a destination in mind, some sort of vision about how they see a just and equitable and fair and thriving society. And then start to work back from there and see, like, what are the steps that society has to take to get to that point. And that could be a million different paths, but to give it meaning, you've got to find the path that you feel like you can influence. And that's a big thing to ask. I mean, even my kids are going to go through that sort of, what's my meaning in life? What do I do? In essence, we all have to ask ourselves those questions. But to get there, you've got to be open-minded. You've got to follow up with the questions that you ask about different things that you think you can influence. For some people, it's a very simple, kind of thing, helping out people who are poverty-stricken in parts of the world, and that's your mission. That's fantastic. That'll make a difference. Other people feel like, I have a skill, in politics, and maybe I could be one of the few positive, politicians out there, and fine, that's your path. Or if you feel like, I want to change the way people think about mental health, or I want to change the way people think about, whatever music, whatever it is, find that thing that you feel like will move the needle slightly and invest in that. It's not clear to everyone. Some people, work their entire lives and then they discover something that moves them. That's fine. It's never too late. And for me, I shifted careers. I only came into this field. I used to be an engineer and working on building buildings, and that was great. And then, I mentioned 9/11, and that started to get me thinking about a different path, and eventually led me to basically the founder of the think tank where I work now, basically finding me and saying, you need to work for us. And that was a whole new world as well. Then when I went to that, I said, oh, I get it now. I get this makes a lot more sense to me. And also you mentioned my background, looking around and saying, oh my God, there's 150 people here and I'm one of three brown people. It's like, okay, then you realize it's like, right, we're talking about issues that affect people of our background, and there's a few people of our background in it. Then you feel kind of like, okay, I need to make this work because there needs to be people like us at the seat of every table that are making decisions that affect us. If you find yourself in a position like that you are able to represent in a field that is underrepresented by people of your background, like that to me is a big sign. Explore this avenue because those places need you. And being in that group, being a representative there is a huge responsibility, but it brings huge rewards. So that's one thing I would say is find that niche where you feel like you can really add value, and that you have the talent and the interest. After exploring 100 different paths, find that path and just grab onto it for dear life and just go run with it.
Amazing, amazing. It's like connecting with a place deep within that really fuels that passion and drive. So thank you so much. I'm sure we could talk about this all day because it's so interesting, so interesting. And we learn so much every time we sit down together and have these conversations. And that's all what it's all about, is learning. So Zahed, if people want to reach out to the listeners and the viewers, how can they get in touch with you?
Um, I'm on X and Blue Sky and LinkedIn. You can just sort of find me there, those platforms. Send me a message from there. You can go to our website at our organization, isdglobal.org, and you'll see me and my work and lots of interesting information about current trends. And you can contact me through there as well. And yeah, just follow on social media.
Thank you so much, Zahed. Is there any final thoughts or final message or anything you wanted to discuss and we didn't get into for our listeners at all?
Not really. I think we covered just about everything. I would just say that, this is what I, call like dinner table conversation. This is kind of this stuff that basically affects everyone. And so everyone should be really, really well informed about it, why it matters, and take our online environments really seriously, because they impact our kids, they impact our political spaces, they impact our cultural lives, everything. So just be well informed about what's going on and be a very, very disciplined, educated, and informed, technology user. That will help, that'll get us halfway there to where we want to be, frankly.
And
Thank
do
you
your
so
own
much.
fact checking.
Yeah. Yes. Be very disciplined about that.
Right, right. Well, thank you so much. And it's been such a pleasure to have you. And Sana, it's that time of our episode.
Yep. We're two Desi girls
Reinventing cultural norms.
with love.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Please rate, subscribe, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow the Rabia and Sana Show on social medias.
Remember, you can watch the video version on YouTube, and don't forget to share, like, and subscribe.
If you want life coaching services, or you are reinventing cultural norms for yourself and think you would be a great guest and want to be on our show, please email contact@therabiaandsanashow.com.
And be sure to check out our next episode. See you next time.
See you next time.